Okay, well, let me first start by thanking the organizers for bringing us all here for both the conference and the program. This is super exciting, and it's great to see so many people I recognize, but so many people who I haven't seen in a really long time as well. This is somewhat of a mixed audience. Can I get just a little information from you about your familiarity with certain concepts? So can I have a show of hands for people who have calculated cuts in planar n equals 4 super Yang-Mills to the multi-loop level? All right, so everybody's comfortable. Well, not everybody. So many people are comfortable with cuts in planar. How about non-planar cuts or color dressed cuts? Okay. Um, Supergravity cuts? Okay, good. Are people are familiar? Oh, so if I were to ask you to go give me an n equals 4 super Yang-Mills planar amplitude via positivity, can I get a show of hands for people who can give me some amplitudes? Planar n equals 4? Okay, great. And have people heard of color kinematics duality before? Some? Okay, cool. All right, great. So I'm gonna get started. So, um, higher loops are challenging even at the integrand level. And I think one of the most recent times I ran into this is a few years ago when Alex and Henrik and I went after n equals 4 super Yang-Mills at 6 loops. And I'm drawing all the vacuum topologies. And of course, you have to dress them in all ways to get all the cubic vacuum topologies, you dress them in all ways to get all the different cuts you need to build to get the full integrand. And and if you're actually evaluating trees to do this cuts, the bookkeeping starts getting very expensive. So you look for ways of recycling this. We introduced a few methods for recycling, either higher loop cuts that we knew about or lower loop cuts towards building this. And it was great. And we did it in finite time. The representation's a little bit of a mess. The power counting's not great. And the reason that matters to us is if we're interested in the UV behavior of a supergravity theory that we're constructing with this, if we're starting with a bad representation of the power counting, pushing that through, means we've got layers and layers and layers we have to excavate before we actually find out what the critical dimension of the supergravity theory is. And so we'd like to have something with a much better power counting. Um, and so one of the questions I hope to answer with this talk is at least a new strategy for minimizing the number of cuts we actually need to evaluate. Um, uh, and the way we're going to exemplify this is by pointing out that only starting with the planar part of the integrand for n equals 4 super Yang-Mills at 3 loops, something that's entirely constrained by dual conformal invariance and positivity, we can systematically push that data out without using an ansatz to tile the rest of the amplitude. And so just to establish some context, I'm going to talk about some of the insights we're using. I mean, one of the most important insight we're using is that we should be calculating with physical on-shell quantities. That when we do this, our expressions are incredibly compact, even at intermediary stages. Um, and one of my favorite places to look at this is even just the 3-point amplitude for both gauge theories and gravity theories. And you see it's incredibly compact in both theories. And of course, the gravity theory is what you get from the gauge theory when you replace the color weight with another copy of the kinematic weights of the gluon. Now, that's just to contrast, for example, with the off-shell 3-graviton vertex. So you don't want to work with this. You really want to work with the on-shell quantities whenever possible. And in fact, if you can get away with working in your gauge theories to answer questions about the dynamic evolution of space and time, then all the better. I'd like so I know there's some people who really like infinite color. So I'm just going to remind you some properties of finite color. These are the structure constants. Uh, in the adjoint for our gauge group, made up of FABCs, so you just dress every cubic vertex with an FABC, and what properties the FABC satisfy? They satisfy antisymmetry around each vertex, and around each edge, they satisfy a Jacobi relation. That's all you need to know for the rest of the talk. Um, of course, just working with compact on-shell data isn't enough because there's an inescapable complexity of insisting on local representations. And this is just a consequence of perturbation theory. Um, and so I've just lined up just scaling. So something that's going polynomial on this log plot, we don't even notice, like graph isomorphism is just a nice straight line as we go to higher multiplicity or higher loop level. When we're talking about something exponential, like the number of planar graphs, right? That's relatively friendly, at least. It's a straight line or a log-log plot. But once we start talking about full non-planar graphs that contribute, we run into problems really quickly because it's just this factorial growth in number of topologies we need to worry about. And this is why anything that helps us beat down this factorial growth and complexity we kind of latch onto. And so one thing that does is the duality between color and kinematics. And so a few slides ago, I reminded us that color factors satisfy Jacobi, so they're not independent for different graphs. In fact, that's incredibly important for gauge invariance, so they're not independent for different graphs. But it turns out you can find representations where your color weights, your color kinematic numerators obey the same algebraic properties, antisymmetry, and Jacobi identities. And that lets you reduce all the kinematic data for all your graphs to a small set of basis graphs, right? When you can achieve this, you get a small group of basis graphs, and you can trivially generate gravitational integrands from your gauge theory integrands when you can make this manifest. And so this is really nice. So one of the first places that was non-trivial that we saw this at loop level, someplace where we actually saw loop momenta engagement was 3 loops. And it turns out that with just this one basis graph, by considering Jacobis on every edge, you can push the data out from this basis graph to everybody else. And for those of you who like planar n equals 4, you'll notice that at least at 3 loops, it was just one planar basis graph. Yeah, so you get everybody from just that one guy. But something I should emphasize is these relations at loop level are all functional. They're all functional relations, which means that the only way in general we know how to go after these, because we don't have Feynman rules for most of our gauge theories that manifestly satisfy color kinematics. The only way we know how to building this is by establishing an ansatz. Maybe so one thing you can do is you can give an ansatz to every graph, which is very expensive, and then just impose these relations as constraints. Or you can give an ansatz for this guy, push him out through the algebraic relations on all the edges, see if your resulting graphs still satisfy all the automorphic symmetry they're supposed to satisfy, and see if you can fix the cuts. But this can get real expensive. This can get real expensive as you go to higher loops. And there's increasing evidence that for some theories that you can't have a local representation that satisfies, so some amplitudes, you may need to go non-local, which makes your ansatz just go crazy expensive. So what if the ansatz is too big or there's no local representation? So that's what this sort of color dual cut tiling that I'm going to be telling you about is here for. It's here to let you push data out from one sector when you have it. Doesn't have to be, oh yeah. No. Well, okay, so you're asking, so I believe, right. So good. So in the mid 2000 teens, Zvi and a student tried to go after 2 loops local with a limited power counting ansatz, local for just pure Yang mills, and they weren't able to satisfy it. This was addressed recently by Alex, James Mangan, Nick Pavao. I think I I think that was all of them, and maybe another. And they gave a much more global ansatz, although I don't know if it was a full ansatz, and they failed to find a local representation. And I think if you give something that saturates the power counting you can expect from Feynman rules for gauge theories, that would be an existent proof that there's no local representation. I'm not sure if I believe this recent paper by Alex and James and Nick has come pretty close. Um, yeah, that's just two loops, pure Yang-Mills. Now, now related, so you know that it's possible to go to pions, to nonlinear sigma model pions from Yang-Mills amplitudes. Related amplitudes at two loops have been found, like colored dual representations of nonlinear sigma model pions. And so, I mean, but in any case, for example, 6 loops is too expensive for me to span. Even in n equals 4 super Yang-Mills, 5 loops was too expensive for me to span. Um, so 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 yeah, but what I like the idea of is having a controlled sector where I can achieve the power counting I want and then push that data around naturally. Now you might wonder why like a naive tiling doesn't work, where you just take a representation of these guys and you just start Jacobiing outward. And it's because the relations feed back on themselves. And if you do something like that, you just won't satisfy the cuts. Um, okay. And so what I'll be talking about today is an agglomerative method, color dual cut tiling. You start with a seed of known integrand data. You set all your other graphs to 0, the contributions of your other graphs to 0. And then starting with the simplest cut topologies, the cut topologies with the minimal number of graphs contributing. You identify unsatisfied data-dominated topologies, so where your data controls all the data that's flowing around in a very specific sense that I'll explain shortly. And you push the data out from the seeded graphs on data via push the data out from the data-dominated topologies to the rest of your graphs. And it's agglomerative in the sense that after you've done that, you've changed the nature of what graphs are no longer being satisfied. So you just keep grabbing more and more graphs. But by definition, you're starting with the simplest cut topologies. And after a very small number, you've closed. Now, I realize that I've introduced some vocabulary here that isn't necessarily going to be super familiar. So I'm going to just review a little bit of terminology just to establish everything and just to give some pictures that we can associate with these ideas. Um, a convenient language for talking about all these games are graphs of graphs. So graphs where every node represents like a Feynman diagram contributing to your amplitude, and the edges in the graph of graphs are operations you can perform on the graphs, simple Whitehead moves to move from one graph to another graph. And so a U hat will simply permute two of the edges around here, so violating the color order. The T hat will sort of pinch and open up, preserving the color order. And so in these graphs of graphs, they'll be showing you every time you see a triangle, then this is an occasion for a Jacobi relation to be satisfied or violated. There are 2m minus 5 double factorial cubic graphs at every multiplicity. Here's an example of 5 points. So at 5 points, you've got 15 graphs. Drawing it in this sort of 3D representation just to make it very obvious that these are 5-point graphs, that there are 2 Jacobis that any graph can be participating in, one for each propagator. Now, as I said before, individual graph numerators can only be gauge dependent if their color weights are not independent. So if you take a full amplitude, you just dress in graph by graph by graph, any individual graph doesn't mean anything, right? It's not physical at all. But if I go into a color basis, Maybe your favorite basis is a trace basis. Maybe you like reducing Jacobi's to some basis set under Jacobi relations. If you go to a basis of color weights and you collect on those, the coefficients of those guys have to be gauge invariant because they're pointing different directions in color space. There's no way for anything to cancel between them, right? For any gauge dependence to cancel. Yeah? Right? And so we call these color ordered or partial amplitudes. A lot of people who do a lot of planar stuff just call them amplitudes, but I'm going to distinguish them. I'm going to call them color ordered amplitudes because you need many of them to talk about a particular full color dressed amplitude in a theory, an actual prediction in like QCD. You'll need many of them. Okay, and so you can use this as data to fix your graph representation, right? So how do you find the graphs contributing to a partial amplitude? You take one graph of the color order you want, and then you just apply t-hats on all edges till closure, and that way you get all the graphs that contribute to your ordered amplitude of the same color order. So the t-hat was the color order preserving operation. Oh, that's not my machine. This is my machine. What did I skip over? I skipped over just the fact that for those of you, those of you know who already know that these polytopes are called associahedra, the one skeletons you get by carving out t-hat till closure. Now, you might think that you need a whole bunch of these guys to touch to get everybody to and so you might think at 5 points that you'd need 6 of these ordered amplitudes or these pentagons at 5 points, because that's what's required to touch every vertex. You need that guy and that guy, that guy, and that guy, and that guy, and that guy. All right, so you need literally 6 to touch every graph, and this is the Kleist-Coif base. Does anybody know how to pronounce Coif? Coif? Kaif? Kaif. The Kleist-Coif basis. And this was proven sufficient by Del Duca, Dixon, and Maltoni. But one of the cool consequences of having Jacobi relations between your graphs is that you actually only need this boundary data. It forms a skeleton of a polytope called a permutahedron. You only need these guys, and Jacobi relations push in from the boundary to an inner ring, and then Jacobi relations push in from that to here. And so you only need to specify this data. All right, and so that means that instead of needing six color ordered amplitudes, 6 different orderings to get the full amplitude, you only need 2, and then you can span everybody else at 5 points. So just to summarize in terms of equations, every ordered amplitude I can write in terms of a basis where I fix 3 legs and just permute around everything else. Okay, and what are the coefficients? These are just rational functions of kinematic Mandelstam invariance. All right, so good. So now that we've done that, we can jump ahead and start actually pushing this through to getting loops. Everything what I said about trees holds to graph organized integrands under on-shell constraints. So if you give me a graph organized integrand, I can apply on-shell conditions to graphs and add them together in the ways they would contribute to cuts, right? And those cuts will obey the same relations as the scattering amplitudes, because after all, our integrand has to satisfy all the cuts. So it has to satisfy all the relations of the cuts. Yeah? So what do I mean by a cut topology? I'm establishing the on-shell condition, so each of my blobs you can think of as an amplitude, but I haven't told you the order yet. I'm just telling you the on-shell conditions, right? So an ordered cut is specifying the vertex of the ordering of the way these guys contribute, depending upon whether this guy's really, if the ordering is as drawn, then I've got 5 particular cubic graphs that can contribute to this, right? But if I give it a color dressed cut, I could have 15 graphs, or the ordering could be different. I could have a different 5 graphs, right? So by an ordered cut, I'm specifying the order of every amplitude that's contributing to my cut topology. And so what I'm calling a data dominated topology is a topology, a cut topology where the cut orders are spanned by the seeded data. So if I know the boundary data, if I know this in terms of whatever, for example, for what we're talking about today, it's going to be planar data, but it doesn't have to be planar. It just has to be in my knowledge, right? But if these two ordered bases have stuff that I know about, then I can talk about all the other orderings. I can talk about all the other 15 graphs, and we'll see examples of how that works. Okay. So, but by data dominated, I mean that I have sufficient data to constrain the basis ordered cuts that I can use tree level relations to tile outwards to everyone else. Okay. So just reminding you that with the approaches, we're going to just start by assigning stuff to some known data and then just use these tree level relations on cuts to push it out. I'm not sewing trees together. I'm literally just applying on-shell kinematics as how these integrans would contribute to cuts. So for the example I'm talking about today, the seeded data we're taking to be planar in n equals 4, right? And so topologies are planar dominated if the basis cut orders, the basis cuts, right, under the tree level relations contain only planar diagrams, right? But the different color orders are going to contain very non-planar diagrams, right? But I can describe their contributions in terms of the basis data doing planar stuff. And so the question we're asking is, are planar dominated cut topologies spanning for my entire integrand? And if so, then a principle like dual conformal invariance or planarity is enough to establish the integrand entirely without ever sewing trees together at all. Okay, so this is what we're starting with. So these guys. Now, what I'm going to show you is that starting from this guy's seeded data, I only need 3 cuts. So every vertex, so I've got every line are on-shell conditions. This refers to a cut topology, right? So there are different orders that can contribute. This cut topology is sufficient to entirely fix this. This cut topology is sufficient to entirely fix this guy. And then this is sufficient to entirely fix that guy. And then similarly, from the half tennis court, we've got 3 next maximal topologies, cut topologies, 2 next squared maximal cut topologies, and 1 final next cube maximal cut topology that finishes pushing the data outwards while maintaining the on-shell conditions in a complementary way to completely span the integrand. So I'm not going to walk through all of them in intricate detail, but I'll take the time to walk through one of them so you get an idea of what's going on with all of it. All right, so this guy. I'm putting little red dots here, just emphasizing that if you like, these are amplitudes and that all these legs are cut. And what we're doing is we're zooming in on this guy, who's the only one where order makes a difference at all. And we're looking then at the 3 different color orders. Okay. No, the colors are pretty, but it's helpful for me to have numeric labels. So this order I'm just going to call 1, 2, 3, 4. So for our planar friends, this is the only order you'll have ever seen. And we'll have the equivalent of an S channel contribution and a T channel contribution, right? And so what's going on? We've got some kinematic weight sitting over the propagator structure. Similarly, we've got, I'm choosing a different order, 1, 4, 2, 3, right? And so it'll have different kinematic weights sitting over different propagator structures. Now, something you can do experimentally, even if you don't even like looking at graphs, but you're happy taking kinematic arguments and just relabeling things, is you can notice that these amplitudes have this relation between them. They're related to each other. I only need one amplitude at 4 points, at 4-point tree level, to one ordered amplitude to know all the other ordered amplitudes. Um, right? And so we're going to use this to relate the data on 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 these on-shell conditions. But remember, we're actually talking about kinematic weights for the whole. So this is just hidden inside three loop graphs. Great. Yeah. So what I did there, I'll just do it again, is I'm gonna redraw this guy. I'm gonna keep the connectivity exactly the same. I'm just gonna redraw him to look more familiar with something we've seen before. This is actually just the same U-channel diagram that we saw earlier. We notice that this guy is very related to this. In fact, it has the same channel. So I'll just draw it to make it a little clearer what's going on. It's exactly the same as this, but these two legs are rotated, right? They're permuted. And what do we get with our FABCs when we rotate? We get a minus sign. So I can rotate it back at the cost of exposing this minus sign. And now I'll just plug these guys in to this expression. Right. Solving for my U-channel guy in terms of the others. We notice that this Mandelstam rational function that's sitting in the field theory relations is just sitting there to eat up this propagator and to give the right type of propagator that should be showing up over here. I just collected terms, just pulled this guy out, right? And then we're just adding stuff together. Of course, we remember our conservation of momentum, that S plus U is minus T. And so we find that what we've recovered from, just applying these field theory relations at the level of on-shell data for the three loop is we've just recovered the Jacobi identity, but the Jacobi identity that always holds when these on-shell conditions are present. Good, so we get rid of that shared propagator everywhere. And now, just to make it very clear what's going on, I just drew these guys a little bigger so we can see what graphs we're actually talking about, what graphs we're actually relating at three loops. We're relating this graph, this sort of crossed triple box, with the ladder graph and this triangle graph. We recall for n equals 4 and n equals 8, we don't have to have triangles in every representation, so we can just throw that guy away. And just directly assign this data to here, right? Under these on-shell cut conditions. But it turns out for n equals 4 super-Yang Mills, this is entirely sufficient. There's no way of doing this assignation that causes you to miss any information. And so this guy's good for all other cut conditions, even though we only assigned it under these on-shell conditions. Similarly, doing the same thing for this cut topology relating two different cut orders lets us express this graph, the B graph, entirely in terms of the A graph. And our next squared maximal cut here lets us get the double crossed ladder. Okay, good. So I showed you how each of these come together. It's the same type of story for each of these, just pushing data here. Now, these guys have more contact terms, and so then there's more information that kind of gets shuffled around by these by these higher multiplicity, next to squared, next to cubed, maximal cut on shell conditions. But again, it's just pushing data around. Um, Good. And so that was sufficient, by the way. That gave us all of n equals 4 at 3 loops. What if you don't actually want to creatively construct it? You just want to know the question about whether planar is enough. It's enough to see if a minimal spanning set of cuts is planar dominated. So at 3 loops, you just ask yourself if all of these cuts are planar dominated, and if they are, then for any gauge theory, through 3 loops, 4 points, you can get the entire integrated from just a planar. And these are all planar dominated. And I can go through the counting with you if you want to speak about it later. What I'd like to do with the rest of the talk is just talk briefly how you can push this data to get n equals 8. So we started with data seeded entirely by dual conformal invariance or positivity. We pushed it out using tree level properties of the theory. And now we're just going to turn it into n equals 8 supergravity, even though it's in a representation that doesn't satisfy the duality between color and kinematics. And so we're going to do this using generalized double copy. This is something that that we figured out. This approach is something we figured out in 2017 on the way to 5 loops when we started noticing structure as we were jumping up and down trying to build n equals 8 supergravity out of an n equals 5 super Yang-Mills representation that wasn't color dual. So we were only pushing things together on the cuts. We were using the fact that we had our gauge theory integrand as a shortcut for doing the state sums for n equals 8 supergravity. But that was at first the only benefit. We just kept noticing these simple answers, and then we found the structure behind the simple answers. So what's the story? The story is that when you've got a representation where every triangle is happy, when you've got happy triangles, when you're satisfying all Jacobi relations, then you can just trivially square each numerator, or at least take its numerator and take a product with another numerator in a theory that's also color dual, and then you'll land on your gravitational theory. All right, so you start from a cubic representation, satisfy all the triangles, you can just naively square it, and then you've got something that satisfies all the gravity cuts. You've got a gravity representation. But what if you've got violations of Jacobi's? So you've got representations where your triangles are unhappy. Those violations of Jacobi double copy with each other to generate the corrective contributions of new contact terms that you add to your gravitational representation. So when Jacobis are satisfied and you double copy, you stay cubic. But if you don't satisfy Jacobi and you just naively square, you've got missing pieces. Those missing pieces are entirely given to you by this square of violations of Jacobi. And it's simple enough that I can just take you through the 3-loop example and still not eat too much into the coffee time. All right? Are we good time-wise? Yeah, because I started pretty late, right? Yeah. Huh? Oh, great. Yeah. Good. Yeah. So no, we'll go through this very quickly. All right, great. So we're going to start with 3-loop cubic graphs. These don't satisfy Jacobi, but you'll notice that all the guys that look like ladder diagrams are all the same. All the guys E through G are the same, and then these guys echo some of that structure, but with some extra contact terms showing up. And the procedure is we're just going to naively double copy. We're just going to square these kinematic weights, assign them to our cubic graphs associated with the gravity theory. And this is just a starting point. We're not going to satisfy all the cuts if this is what we used. We don't have the right answer if this is all we used, right? Because our representation doesn't satisfy Jacobi. But for free, we satisfy all the maximal cuts. Those are automatically satisfied in the supergravity theory because on Next to maximal cut conditions, we've just got a 4-point tree. As we saw before, as I walked through kind of in detail, you always satisfy Jacobi under those on-shell conditions. So you get all of these cuts for free as well. Indeed, for the representation I showed you, you satisfy the vast majority of these next squared cuts. In fact, you only have 4 non-vanishing cuts. These are the only 4 guys that have on-shell data where Jacobis aren't satisfied. So you need to double copy the violations of the Jacobi to get the contributions to so bad at using this I'm not, is it okay if I use this? Yeah. So so each of these guys is just going to represent a contact graph in your 5-loop supergravity theory, and its contribution you'll get by just reading off the violations of Jacobis. And so I'll walk through very slowly one example, which is just this guy who's nice and complicated. He's got a 5-point interaction, right? And so here are all 15 cubic graphs that could, right? 15 cubic graphs. So we're just going to take this guy and expand in all the ways you could write down a 5-point tree graph, and then these cubic graphs you get for free. So you get 15 graphs. The green lines are the off-shell lines, and then everything else is on-shell. It turns out these 3 guys are related by Jacobi relations, right? Or, so these guys form a triangle in the graph of graphs I showed earlier. So what do I mean by a violation of Jacobi? I mean, I bring them all onto the same side, and if it vanishes, then I'm satisfying Jacobi, and if it doesn't vanish, then I've got a contribution that's violating Jacobi. And this I can double copy with other contributions that are violating Jacobi to get the contact term in the supergravity theory. But it turns out that this guy and this guy, even though they're completely different graphs, are contributing with the same weight on shell. And this guy doesn't contribute because he's got a triangle, right? The reason these guys are contributing with the same weight is because, remember, all these guys got exactly the same weight, just pushed from the tennis court, and this guy's just coming in with a minus sign relative to the other guy. So in fact, this doesn't have a violation of Jacobi. This guy, by considering this graph, right, all the Jacobis here, it's just coming in with a 0. In fact, all of those guys come in with zeros. All of these guys, when you sum up the contributions, it's very simple, just an S squared, like a literal net K1 plus K2 squared external. So, we just plug that in, having summed over all the graphs, and we find that this kinematic weight is just minus 2S squared. All right, so you just do that to all of your graphs, right? To all of these guys who were missing data, and you're done. You've built n equals 8 supergravity, starting just from a representation of n equals 4 that didn't have any particularly special properties, just reading off violations of Jacobi and double copying those. Yeah. Okay. So what did I do? I showed you that you could start with the planar sector, 3 loops. You can just push the data outwards without invoking any fancy ons, let's say, just based upon properties that have to be true in a graph-based representation under on-shell conditions, but you tile things together in such a way that at the end you've captured all your off-shell data. All right, and it just came from these simple cut topologies was sufficient to just relate everybody in a way. And these are, I didn't have to start from the simplest. I could have started from like the most complicated, right? The spanning set of topologies. But this gives you something that is very easy and straightforward to push through, and something that is actually designed to be well parallelizable for going after some large targets. How will this help us with going after Higher loop supergravity. So the way we so I don't we put out two papers with different five loops n equals eight supergravity integrons. One was horrendous bad power counting. It was just we'd started with a gauge theory representation that wasn't great in terms of its manifest UV properties. We pushed it through our machinery to show that we could build n equals eight supergravity, but there were so many spurious UV divergences. It would have taken a long time to march through cancel them to get to the critical dimension. So what we did is we gave n equals five super Yang mills at n equals four super Yang mills at five loops, a global ansatz to minimize the power counting, pushing it down, 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 which was expensive. But at the end, we had something nice that when we pushed it through generalized double copy, we had a supergravity integrand we could integrate in the UV limit. This points to a strategy where we can take a controlled sector and jump up and down on the manifest UV behavior and then just tile that outwards in a controlled way. 6 loops maximal supergravity and 5 loops n equals 5 supergravity are going to be important testing grounds, and there's lots of stuff for us to do. So.
Thank you for this very nice talk. Other questions?
Thanks a lot for the talk. In all these cases, when you have graphs of graphs, do you have a polytopic realization of them? I mean, can you embed them in some physical space and see that what was the true shape, not only as a graph but as a polytope?
I don't, because I don't, but people have at least, well, so I'm gonna ask you to answer. So no, right behind you, right behind you. Nope, the one who knows everything about Bermuda-Hedron. So yeah, Nick, do you know about any concrete realizations where the Bermuda-Hedron actually has data that gives it a polytope in some space in the graph of graphs?
Could you say
the question again?
Yes, please.
So Thomas asked me if I could actually give coordinates to the graph of graphs such that I actually had a polytope and not just a one skeleton of polytopes. And so I was going to ask you.
I mean,
yeah. Well, certainly, I mean, certainly it's possible. It's possible for like a particular color order, right? I mean, that's right. Yeah.
And for 3 level, sure, right?
Yeah.
Beyond 3 level,
and
sure.
and I want to say Nima and friends, Neiman ABHY.
Yeah, that would be 3 level. Yeah.
Would be tree level,
I
right?
think it should be possible, but yeah, I'll have to think a little bit. I think it should, maybe.
I shouldn't have put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
Okay.
It will be interesting beyond 3 level, right?
Yeah. Well, and so I would say that it's certainly possible to do under various on-shell conditions, right? And that you can put and that these pieces fit together. So I mean, I think if you're generalized enough with what you're happy with, but I think also, yeah, no, I think that's a great question.
Because there's a question, I mean, what's the meaning of like facets of it? And I mean, you cannot see this from the one skeleton, really.
Right.
You just see this triangle, small triangle.
You just see the triangles, yeah.
Thank you for the nice talk. I was wondering if there's anything interesting to be said about theories that do have triangles, because from the color graph point of view, when you start playing with these Jacobi identities on the graphs, you generate a lot of them, and those can be just deleted and you get some lower loop thing. So when you start to do lots of these Jacobi operations on a graph, there's maybe some sort of grading where you can say you descend onto some lower loop sector, but you never go up. So is there anything interesting you can say about these theories?
No, there's nothing, but so maybe let me ask the question back again. So for all gauge theories, I can take my color weights and reduce to a minimal basis, including Casimir's and then contributions from lower loop orders. Is that what you were talking about? Or what were you talking about?
Yeah, it's just that the step where you're showing this, you had started with the ladder and then you applied a Jacobi and you got something with a triangle, something without a triangle.
Oh, yes.
And you discarded the triangle because in n equals 4 or 8, there are no triangles. But from the just pure Lie graph point of view, then this just gives you some lower loop thing. You can reduce that triangle.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
No, so good. So it's not going to be, so in general, when I'm doing this, so I could have done the same thing just for pure Yang Mills, right? But I would have started keeping these guys around. But I can read if I'm dressing with color weights, I can reduce it to lower order stuff and Casimir's. And I absolutely believe that there's kinematic structure equivalents that you can do the same thing with. Yeah, possibly under integration.
More questions?
The example you went through is, I'm going to interpret it as using the Jacobi to unwind the non-planar three-loop contributions and finding that they can all be expressed in terms of planar ones. Is it clear there's no topological obstruction to this unwinding at higher loops that you can always?
Oh, that's not clear at all. No, so good. Let me emphasize this fact. So for 3 loops, no matter what the theory is, at 4 points, the 4-particle cut, right? So sewing together, 2 6 trees, the 4-particle cut, and the lower cuts are all spanned by planar data, right? So there's an entire spanning set that's planar dominated. So I could always do something like that for any theory. That's no longer true at 4 loops. In general, 4 loops n equals 4 super-Yang Mills has a sufficiently friendly power counting that I think it's possible. But in general, you won't be able to cover everybody with planar. You will need extra data, right? And you'll need to get that extra data from somewhere. It is possible to get some of that extra data by considering higher loop planar, which is something we explored in our 6-loop paper, was recycling higher loop planar and dragging it down to lower loop non-planar, which so if all you care about is planar, then there are probably ways around the limitations of topology. For me, it's more having a well-defined sector where I completely understand its contributions to all cuts in some given ordering, and planar was convenient for talking about as an example.
Okay, there is time for a quick question. I don't see any, so let's thank John Joseph again.